iron and roses, a love that broke every rule. The first time Mara looked at her, she felt something crack open inside her chest. Not the slow, gentle kind of opening that love stories usually promise, but the violent, terrifying kind like a fault line, giving way beneath stone that had been pressed down for years under unbearable weight. She was standing in the corridor of Whitmore Correctional Facility for Women, clipboard in one hand, keys jangling at her hip, watching the new intake walk through the heavy steel doors in a single file line. And then she saw her, inmate number 4471, a woman named Sofia Reyes, with dark eyes that held entire storms inside them and a stillness about her that seemed almost holy. Against the chaos of metal doors, slamming and officers shouting and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, Mara turned away fast, pressed her pen hard into her clipboard, and told herself that what she had just felt was nothing. She had been telling herself that lie for a long time. She was used to it. Mara Callahan had worked at Whitmore for 6 years. She was 34 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet, the kind of woman who laughed rarely, but when she did, the sound surprised people, like sunlight breaking unexpectedly through a ceiling of clouds. She had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in the Rust Belt, raised by a mother who loved hard but asked no questions, and she had learned early that the safest thing you could do in life was keep your feelings locked behind your ribs where no one could inspect them. She had become a corrections officer because the job offered structure, and structure offered safety, and safety was the closest thing to peace she had ever been able to afford. She had given 6 years of her life to these walls. She knew every crack in the plaster, every faulty hinge, every inmate's routine, and every guard's weakness. What she did not know, what she had never allowed herself to explore, was what it meant to want someone the way she found herself wanting Sofia Reyes. By the end of that woman's first week inside Whitmore, Sofia was in for 3 years on a financial fraud conviction. She was 30 years old, a former accountant from the city who had made desperate choices trying to keep her dying. Mother's medical bills from swallowing, the family whole. She did not belong in prison the way some people do not belong in cages, not because she was innocent of what she had done, but because there was something essential and gentle inside her that confinement seemed designed specifically to destroy. She adapted quietly, smartly, without complaint, reading library books in the evenings and keeping mostly to herself during the day. She observed everything, and somewhere in the middle of her second week she began to observe Mara. It started with small things. Sofia noticed that Officer Callahan was the only guard who never raised her voice unless something genuinely dangerous was happening. She noticed that Mara always paused outside the cell of a particular elderly inmate named Dorothea to make sure the woman had received her evening medication. She noticed that when Mara walked through the common room doing rounds, her face was stern but her eyes were soft, always moving carefully over the room the way a lighthouse beam moves, over water, not to expose anything, but to make sure no one was drowning in the dark. Sofia began looking for Mara, the way you look for something that steadies you when the ground beneath you is uncertain. She did not yet have a name for what that meant. For months, they existed in the architecture of their respective roles, officer and inmate, keeper and kept, and the distance between them was absolute and necessary and real. Mara enforced it with discipline. She was professional at all times, never spoke more than what the job required, never allowed her gaze to linger. But prisons are strange places, and time inside them moves differently than it does in the world outside, and slowly, and despite everything, a kind of knowing built up between the two women. The way sediment builds at the bottom of still water, it was made of nothing dramatic. It was made of the look Sofia gave her once when Mara stopped a verbal confrontation from escalating in the yard, a look that said, "I see exactly who you are." It was made of the afternoon Sofia was assigned kitchen duty and Mara stood post nearby and Sofia hummed something low and beautiful under her breath without knowing she was being heard, and Mara stood very still and did not move until the song was finished. It was made of a single moment in November, when the heating system failed and the block grew brutally cold, and Mara walked past Sofia's cell and found her sitting on the edge of her bunk shivering, and Mara said nothing but came back 20 minutes later and slid an extra blanket through the bars without logging it, and walked away before Sofia could thank her. Sofia pressed that blanket to her face and breathed into it, and wept silently for reasons she could not entirely explain. They began to talk only in the rarest moments, and always carefully, always quietly, always within the bounds of what might technically pass as routine interaction. But the conversations were not routine. Sofia told Mara once in the library where Mara stood post on Tuesday afternoons that she used to believe she was built for a smaller life than she wanted, that wanting big things was a kind of arrogance. She had been quietly punished for her whole life. Mara listened without moving for a long moment and then said only that she thought most people were living a fraction of the lives they were actually capable of. It was the most personal thing Mara had said to another person in years, and it frightened her so deeply afterward that she requested a reassignment away from the library post. She was denied. Something in her was relieved. The crisis came in the form of another inmate, a woman named Renata, who had taken a violent dislike to Sofia for reasons born from boredom and proximity, and a need to dominate something. The harassment started small, the way it always does, and escalated over several weeks into something uglier. Mara saw the progression and documented what she could and reported it and watched the machinery of the institution grind slowly toward a response that came nearly too late. On a Thursday evening in March, she heard raised voices from the showers and she ran, and she arrived to find Sofia backed against the tile wall with Renata advancing on her and two of Renata's associates standing at the entrance like sentries. What happened in the next 90 seconds was quick and controlled and completely by the book. Mara neutralized the situation with zero physical force on Sofia and got Renata and her associates separated and escorted to segregation. And then she stood in the hallway outside the showers, breathing slowly, hands braced against the wall, feeling the adrenaline move through her in waves. Sofia appeared in the doorway a moment later and looked at her, and what passed between them in that long, unguarded silence was enormous, and quiet and completely undeniable for the first time. Neither of them said a word. They did not have to. After that evening, something changed, not in what they did, because they continued to do nothing, continued to maintain every professional boundary that the law and ethics and the brutal logic of their situation demanded, but in what they both knew. Mara began to reckon honestly with something she had been running from since she was 19 years old, a truth about herself she had buried under work and routine and the daily insistence that she simply did not have time for certain kinds of feelings. She lay in her apartment at night and stared at the ceiling and thought about Sofia in a cell across the city and felt something enormous and aching move through her that was not lust, or not only lust, but something more total than that, a desire to know someone completely, to be known in return, to stop living in the fraction. She did not act on any of it. She could not. The consequences were clear and serious, and the power imbalance between them made any action unconscionable while Sofia was inside. Mara understood all of this completely. She held every boundary anyway, and the love, and because that is what it was, that is what she finally let herself call it in the privacy of her own heart, did not diminish for being contained. It simply waited. Sofia was released 16 months before the end of her sentence, due to good behavior and a successful appeal regarding sentencing guidelines. On the morning of her release, Mara was not on duty. She had requested the day off weeks before as soon as she knew the date, because she did not trust herself to stand in that corridor and watch Sofia walk out into the light and keep her face composed. She sat instead in a coffee shop 3 miles from Whitmore and drank bad coffee and looked out the window at the cold spring morning and thought about all the ways a person could love something they had no right to claim. She had almost convinced herself that this was the end of it, that Sofia would walk out, and the world would be enormous and full, and she would never look back. And that would be the right thing, and Mara would carry this quietly the way she had always carried everything that mattered to her, alone and without ceremony. Sofia found her 3 weeks later. She had asked Dorothea, who had been released months before, If she remembered the name of that quiet officer with the soft eyes, Dorothea remembered everything. Sofia walked into the same coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. She had done her research. She had always been precise, and sat down across from Mara without preamble and said only that she had spent 16 months thinking about what it meant to want a bigger life than the one you believed you were allowed to have, and she had decided she was done believing that. Mara sat very still for a long moment, and then, for the first time in a very long time, she laughed. That sudden, surprised sound like sunlight breaking through cloud cover, and it filled the small coffee shop like something returning from a long exile, and Sofia smiled watching it happen, because she had known somehow, from the very first corridor, from the very first careful, luminous look, that this was exactly the sound she had been waiting for. What followed was not easy because real things rarely are. There were complications and questions and people who did not understand. And Mara navigated a formal review process at work that examined whether any misconduct had occurred during Sofia's incarceration, and it was determined correctly that no boundary had ever been crossed while Sofia was in custody. Mara retained her position, but she transferred facilities anyway, because she understood that integrity is not only about what you can prove, but about what you can live with. She and Sofia built something slowly, over months and then years, the way you build something when you have both spent a long time living smaller than your actual capacity, carefully, brick by brick with enormous attention to what is real. If you have ever loved something you were told you had no right to love, or if you have ever held yourself in patient discipline waiting for the moment when you could finally reach toward what you truly wanted, then you already know what this story feels like from the inside. You do not need me to explain it. You just need someone to tell you that the waiting can be worth it, that the boundary holding can be an act of love, that some connections are real enough to survive, even the most impossible architecture built around them. If this story moved something in you, if you felt the weight of that corridor, the cold of that cell block, the warmth of that coffee shop breaking open at last, please consider showing this video some love. Like it, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that real connection finds its way through the hardest walls. Your support keeps these stories alive and reaching the people who need them most. Before the final word here, I want to ask you something personal. Drop a comment below and tell me whether you believe in love that waits. Love that holds every rule and every boundary and still does not disappear. Tell me if you have ever felt that. I want to read every single one. Some loves do not arrive loudly. They arrive in blankets slid through bars in November, in songs half heard across kitchen tiles, in coffee drunk alone on a morning you asked for quietly so that you could grieve in peace. They arrive finally across a small table in a coffee shop on a Tuesday, in the form of someone who did their research, who remembered what you said in a library once, who walked through a door and sat down and told you plainly that they were done living small. That is how Mara's love arrived. That is how Sofia came home, not to a place, but to the one person who had always, without a single word being said, made the world feel less like a sentence to endure and more like a life worth showing up for.